All right, everybody, welcome back. We are about to launch into another deep dive, and this time, oh boy, this time we are tackling The Witcher.
Yes, always exciting.
But we are not just talking monsters and magic, no sir. Today is all about how our listener felt the books, those gritty Sapkowski originals, stack up against the Netflix show.
Yeah.
Because we have all been there, right? You finish a show,
Oh, absolutely.
and that question just eats at you.
Yeah.
Did the book do it better?
It's the age-old question, the adaptation question.
Exactly. And, with The Witcher, our listener brought up some really interesting points. Like, one of the big ones was this whole nonlinear storytelling thing. Because the books, you even mentioned in your notes, they don't exactly go in a straight line.
They do not. It's more like, following Geralt after a tavern brawl.
Right. Kind of all over the place.
Yeah.
And the show, at least in those first couple of seasons, seemed to really take that and run with it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, timelines all jumbled up, characters meeting in a totally different order than you get in the books.
Yeah, it definitely threw some viewers for a loop. I remember a lot of head-scratching in the fandom.
Oh, I bet. But here's what is so cool about what you pointed out. This wasn't just the show messing it up. This actually lines up with how Sapkowski writes, intentionally.
Exactly. Sapkowski, he's not just dropping us into a traditional hero's journey kind of story. He's doing something much more deliberate with how he structures those early Witcher tales.
Almost like he's setting off these little world-building explosions, right?
That's a great way to put it, because you get these pieces, these glimpses of history, of important characters, even hints of the bigger picture long before the main plot with Ciri really gets going.
So are you saying that by jumbling up the timeline, the showrunners were actually trying to capture that same feeling? Wait, what's going on here? Do you get the books?
I think so. It's ambitious, no doubt. Whether it worked perfectly or not is debatable, but they were definitely going for that same feeling of piecing together the puzzle alongside Geralt. You are not just handed everything neatly at the start.
So it's less about directly adapting plot points, more about translating that experience.
Exactly. Because when you're talking about adaptation, it should be about capturing the soul of the source material, not just the bullet points.
Now, that is a perspective I really like. And speaking of souls and characters with maybe a surprising amount of depth, our listener pointed out a huge difference in how the books and the show introduce Yennefer. Like, in the books, she is already this untouchable sorceress.
Oh, absolutely.
There is mystery there, but it's more about the power she holds in the present.
Book Yennefer is a force to be reckoned with, for sure. You get glimpses of her past, sure, but they're just that, glimpses. Her story is very much focused on the present.
But the show, on the other hand, goes all in on the whole tragic backstory thing. We see the discrimination she faced, her brutal transformation into a sorceress. I mean, talk about a way to really tug at the heartstrings.
It's true, and that's such a smart adaptation choice because it fundamentally changes how we connect with Yennefer as viewers. In one version, you meet her already at the peak of her power. In the other, you're right there with her, experiencing her vulnerability, seeing the events that shape her into the Yennefer we meet later on.
See, this is why I love a good deep dive.
Yeah.
It's not about saying, oh, the books are better or the show ruined everything. It's about appreciating how those creative decisions, those differences, make each version hit differently.
Exactly.
And speaking of hitting differently, let's talk about Geralt himself, because our listener brought up some points that really got me thinking about how Geralt went through, or maybe didn't go through, quite the transformation from page to screen.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're talking about how differently the show and the books can hit. And one of the things our listener pointed out was how Geralt spends a lot of time in his own head, right? Like,
Yeah.
he is always thinking through these really complex questions, these moral gray areas.
Yeah.
But then you have Show Geralt, who's amazing in his own right, but he's way more about, like, that, you know the one I'm talking about, that stoic, world-weary stare.
Yeah.
Like, he is judging every monster contract and every tavern brawl that comes his way.
Yeah.
So is that just Hollywood being Hollywood, taking this really introspective character and just cranking up the action hero dial? What do you think?
Well, it's a tricky one, right? Because how do you translate those internal struggles, that thought process, onto the screen in a way that works visually? It's not an easy thing to adapt.
Especially with Geralt, because in both the books and the show, so much of what makes him interesting, that internal conflict, the whole trying to be neutral in a world that doesn't really do neutral.
Exactly. He's constantly wrestling with that.
Like, evil is evil, lesser evil, still evil, the classic Geralt.
And the books can pull that off so well because we're right there in his head. We see those mental gymnastics as he tries to navigate these impossible situations.
But the show doesn't have that luxury, right? So how do they get that same idea across?
They have to get creative. They have to rely more on how his actions or sometimes even his inaction plays out on screen.
So it's less about what he's thinking and more about how the world, how other characters react to him trying to stay out of it.
Exactly. That stoicism, that whole I'm too old for this vibe he gives off, it becomes a kind of action in itself. It's a visual representation of that internal struggle that the books can convey through his thoughts.
It's a really interesting way to think about it. And it's not just the serious stuff that gets handled differently. It feels like the show and the books have a very different sense of humor. Like the books, I don't know about you, but there were times I was laughing out loud at how Sapkowski could just throw in these really dark, sarcastic lines that would just catch you off guard.
Oh, absolutely. Sapkowski's humor is definitely one of the highlights of the book.
But the show,
Yeah.
much more serious, right? Like, did those jokes just get lost in translation somewhere along the way?
Well, it's more that the books and the show use humor in different ways. It's like, in the books, humor is this pressure valve. It breaks up the darkness, gives the reader a chance to breathe.
Okay, yeah, I see what you mean.
It also lets Sapkowski comment on the absurdity of the world, of the situations Geralt finds himself in. It creates this kind of shared understanding between the author and the reader.
It feels very wink, wink, nudge, nudge.
Exactly. But the show, because it's a visual medium, it leans into different tools to create that same effect. So instead of going for laughs per se, the show uses things like atmosphere, music, even just the way a scene is shot to build tension and release it in different ways.
It's so true. Like, I'm thinking about those long, lingering shots of Gerald, the music swelling. You don't get that same feeling in the books.
It's a different approach to storytelling, but it can be just as effective. Like one's a darkly funny story told around a campfire, the other is the sweeping epic with a full orchestra.
Love that analogy. It really makes you appreciate those creative choices.
Yeah.
Right? Like, it's not just that they change things. It's about why they might have made those decisions and what it brings to the table. And our listener definitely pick up on that with one of the biggest changes between the books and the show. Ciri. Because in the books, it feels like her story, while incredibly important, it takes a bit to become the central focus.
Yeah.
But in the show, bam, episode 1, Ciri's story is front and center.
Yeah.
She's this huge mystery right from the get-go.
It's true. She goes from being an important character to, like, the most important character right away.
So why the change? Was it just Netflix needing that can't miss this factor to hook viewers?
It might have been partly that. Books, especially big fantasy epics, they can afford to take their time a bit, let the reader settle in, explore the world at a more leisurely pace.
Right, right. Because with a book, you already have the reader invested just by picking it up.
Exactly. But TV, it's a different beast. Especially these days with streaming and binge watching, you've got to grab the audience's attention immediately. And what's more attention-grabbing than this young princess, on the run, tied to destiny in ways even she doesn't fully understand?
It's true. And honestly, as a viewer, it worked on me. I was hooked on Ciri's story from the first episode. And speaking of things that really draw you into that world, the listener also mentioned how much more prominent politics felt in the show. Both versions have Nilfgaard doing their whole evil empire thing, but it felt so different between the page and the screen.
It goes back to that idea of playing to the strengths of the medium, right? Sapkowski, in the books, he's a master of weaving these big, complex themes into Geralt's smaller-scale monster hunting adventures. Like, he'll be dealing with some prejudiced villager one day, then facing down a terrifying beast the next, and somehow it all ties into these larger political realities without ever feeling forced.
It's subtle, but it's there. It makes you think.
Exactly. But the show, because it's visual, it can actually show us those kingdoms clashing, those political schemes playing out on a grand scale.
So it's like, here's your political intrigue now with added explosions. And speaking of upping the ante, our listener picked up on how magic in the show is a lot more, well, flashy.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Was that just Hollywood magic taking over all special effects and no real substance?
It's a fine line, right? Because part of what makes magic so compelling in the books is that it's rare. When it does happen, it feels weighty, dangerous. You get the sense that there is a real cost.
Yeah. It's treated with this sense of awe and terror, which makes sense given how powerful it is.
Right. And the show, to its credit, tries to maintain that even with all the cool visuals. Like, they still show how much those spells take out of Yennefer.
It's not just like, oh, magic, no big deal. She's visibly exhausted, even drained after using it.
Exactly. So they found ways to still convey that sense of cost, even when they are going all out with the special effects.
So it's like They can have their CGI cake and eat it too, as long as it still feels true to the rules of that world. Which kind of feels like a good way to sum up this whole books versus show conversation, right?
Absolutely. It's not about checking boxes like, did they adapt this scene exactly right? Or is this character exactly as I pictured them? It's about looking at those choices and asking yourself, what works about this version of the story? What makes it unique and engaging in its own right?
It's about keeping an open mind.
Exactly. Because both the books and the show have their strengths, their own ways of drawing you into this rich world that Sapkowski created.
Couldn't have said it better myself. So for our listener who has clearly spent some quality time with both versions of The Witcher, what's the biggest takeaway here? What should they keep in mind as they continue to explore this world?
Don't get too hung up on the differences. Embrace them. Enjoy the journey, whether it's through the pages of a book or on the screen. Ask yourself, what resonates with me? What unique insights am I gaining from each experience?
Because at the end of the day, that is the real magic of adaptation.
I completely agree.
Well said. And on that note, folks, it's time for us to wrap up this deep dive. Big thanks to our expert for sharing their incredible insights and to our listener for the fantastic topic suggestion. We will see you all next time for another deep dive.
Listen to more interesting podcasts on Planet Alibra